It's a great honor and privilege to introduce Michael Jankelowitz. We're here in the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem. Michael, you originally come from PE, but your grandparents came from Lithuania and Latvia, and you've always been passionate about Jewish history, and you went back to your roots, back to Lithuania and to Latvia. So if you can tell us a little bit about your grandparents and the history of your family.
Thanks, Les. So I'll begin with my late father's side, Colin Robert Jankelowitz, who the family called Chona, Elchanan Reuven Ben Yehuda Yaakov, who was born in Kruk in 1924 and came to South Africa in 1930 with his mother. My late grandfather was Yehuda Yaakov Leber, they called him, Jankelowitz, who married his first cousin, Ita Feiger Schwartz, also from Kruk. And in actual fact, I'm named after my late grandmother's father, Michael Schwartz from Kruk. And here you have a picture of him sitting on the porch of his house in Kruk. So that is the story of my father's side. My mother was Salome Shulamis Horwitz, who is the daughter of the late Shmuel Aryeh ben Harav Shlomo Horwitz from Shavel in Lithuania, who married my grandmother Rachel Rosengarten from Riga. And those are my ancestors. I was very fortunate 2 years ago to have the opportunity to walk in the footsteps of my ancestors in northern Lithuania. I'll begin with my father's side from Kruk. There was a seminar in late August in Zager. Zager is a town on the border between Lithuania and Latvia. And there just happened to be a seminar on the Jews of Zager. And as I'm a big football fan, and I went to Estonia to see Real Madrid play against Atletico in the Europa Cup final, I decided it would be a good opportunity to mix two things that I like. I like my soccer, my football, and I enjoy my Jewish heritage and my Jewish culture. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to see where the Jankelowitz and Horwitz families are from. So I did a bit of homework on Google, and I saw that in Zager there were no hotels, but 15 minutes drive to the east from Zager is this town called Uniskis, which my family called Janashik. And I remember how my late dad used to talk about going to the big city of Janashik. So I found a hotel in Janashik, Uniskis, and when I arrived in the hotel I said, there's time in the afternoon, there's summertime, I want to go and see Kruk, which I always knew was a hick town, a very small village, to the east of Uniskis. So I took a cab. The owner of the hotel told me what a cemetery is in Lithuanian, and I went to the Žaidų Kapinės, the cemetery. I explained to the driver, who didn't know any English, but I had written down Žaidų Kapinės, and I told him this is where I want to go. A short ride, 10 minutes. We arrived in in Krukai they call it, and this is how it looks. Everything is very agricultural. Not many houses, but he took me to a Catholic cemetery, and I said, this doesn't look like the Jewish cemetery. Everyone had explained to me how the Jewish cemetery looks. So I told him this is not where we should be going. He asked some peasant lady if she could please help him find the Jewish cemetery, and she pointed out to this barren piece of land, and he proceeded, and lo and behold, we arrived at the Jewish cemetery just as it had been explained to me. I come to the cemetery. There's a nice green fence around the cemetery. The cemetery seems to be well looked after. But I was a bit perturbed. I said, how am I going to open the gate? I said, well, maybe it's not even locked. So I went to the gate. It was all cobweb, and I pulled down the handle, and sesame, the gate opened, and I was in the ancient Jewish cemetery of Kruk. My goal was to see if I could find any tombstones relating to my family. Many of the tombstones must have disintegrated because of the weather, but going from tombstone to tombstone, I found the tomb of Chana, the daughter of Isaac Getzel. Now, Isaac Getzel Jankelowitz is a legend in our family. He is a gentleman who married twice and had 13 children. And I was very moved, and as you can see, I took a picture, and it's still legible to this day. The tomb of Chana Jankelowitz, who died as an infant in 1915. So I already felt that one day, having been in northern Lithuania, I really felt that I was achieving what I had come to this part of the world for. So I walked around the cemetery, as I said, well looked after, nothing vandalized or anything. And I walked, and in the village, everything very simple, farmhouses, chickens in the street, goats, a few dogs, right? But not many people outside. It's summer, it was hot. So I got a feeling that this is where I'm from. These are my roots. And my late father used to tell me, don't judge someone on his appearances. Don't judge somebody where he grew up. You must judge a person on his merits. And you have to give people an opportunity to learn, to get an education. He said, this is where I grew up. He used to tell me he grew up in a village, right, which was agricultural. Many of the people were illiterate, but he came to South Africa. He was given an opportunity. He studied. He became a lawyer. But he told me that if he hadn't been given the opportunity, who knows what would have happened to him. So this was a lesson I carry with me until today. Don't judge somebody on his color. Don't judge somebody on the way he looks. Judge a person on giving him the opportunity to take the opportunity to make something of his life. So after I got the feeling of what Kruk was about, I said, well, no need to call the taxi. I saw a bus stop, right, and it was written Uniskis. I got on the bus, I paid the bus driver, and he took me straight back to the hotel in Uniskis, in Yanushuk. Now, what was interesting, recently in Uniskis, there are two synagogues that have been refurbished. One called the White Synagogue, and the other called the Red Synagogue. And it was explained to me that one synagogue was used in the summer and the other one was used in the winter. the winter synagogue was the red synagogue, right? Because it's red, so it's warmer in the winter, and the white synagogue is used in the summer because it's white, and in the heat you're supposed to wear white clothing. But the guide said, well, 2 Jews and 3 synagogues, so apparently this is why there are 2 synagogues in Janešik, because there was a faribel, a bit of a fight between the gaboim of the shul, the leaders of the shul, and because of the fallout, the one section went and built their own synagogue. Today there are no Jews in Janešik. Today Uniskis is without Jews, but the synagogues are used as cultural centers, and one of the synagogues is used as a museum to explain what Judaism is all about. So it was very, very interesting to see how they go about explaining what the Yiddishkeit is about. And as we know, there are many such museums all over the world that explain what Judaism is about. This is inside the White Synagogue with a very important lady, Sarah Menobla, who wrote a book on Zagari, on Zagar, on the town where her parents are from. And Sarah Menobla is part of an association that take care of the town of Zagar, which I will talk about in a few seconds.
And where does Sarah live?
Sarah lives in Jerusalem. She's approaching 90. She was the head of overseas broadcasting of the Israel Broadcasting Association, but this was the first time that I actually got to meet her and hear from her, and I read her fascinating book about Zagar. Today they call it Zagari, but I'll call it what my family called it, Zagar.
Mark, can I just mention, with the white synagogue and the red one, it's very similar to Keidan, where they've also got 2 synagogues, and we were told that the large synagogue is used in the summer and the smaller one in the winter, and the reason in Keidan why they did, and maybe also over here as well, is that it's very expensive to heat up the synagogue in the cold, so they go into the smaller one also in the winter. So maybe that could also be one of the reasons.
Very interesting, although I saw that both of them were not small.
Were they the same
more
size?
or less the same size. But it was fascinating, and also to see how the local authorities are making an effort to preserve the Jewish past of their country. Unfortunately, from what I have read, this isn't the policy of the government of Lithuania, but who cover up that the majority of the Jews who were killed in Lithuania were not killed by Germans. They were killed by Lithuanian collaborators of the Nazis. So, to go back, I stayed in Janešik, in this hotel opposite the white and red shul, and I met a couple from the United States, Alan Bradbard and Rosemary Feinberg, who came to the seminar that I was going to attend, and they stayed in Uniskis because they also couldn't find a bed and breakfast or hotel in Zagar, and decided instead of home hospitality it would be much more convenient and comfortable to stay in this hotel. So they ferried me up and down between Uniskis and Zagar when we traveled to the seminar. Now Zagar is a very interesting village, town. Firstly, historically, the Jews of northern Lithuania were rounded up on Yom Kippur in 1941, and they were all marched on Yom Kippur after they'd been taken out of shul. They were marched to Zagar. On the next day, on the 11th of Tishrei, the day after Yom Kippur, they all had to dig their own graves in a ravine, and they were shot and buried in this forest outside of Zager. The Jews of Kruk, the Jews of Yuniskis, and the Jews of Zager. A total of almost 4,000 Jews were executed by the collaborators of the Nazis and buried. Here is the plaque in the center of the forest where the Jews were executed, and I was very moved that as I had ancestors who were shot on the 11th of Tishrei to say Kaddish and El Maleh Rachamim for all the attendants at this seminar. And this is the forest. Everything is green today. Everything is so pastoral that it's very, very difficult to comprehend that these beautiful green natural places were actually the killing grounds of Jews.
And they were actually shot.
They were all shot, right? Shot and buried in a mass grave. And it was, again, I spoke about how I saw the cemetery in Kruk, where my ancestors who died of natural causes were buried, and then to come to Zager, and to see a mass grave where Jews were executed. It was something very, very, very difficult. But what I can share with you is that this association that is taking care of the heritage of the Jews of northern Lithuania, they are also not only marking the murder of Jews, but they are also commemorating the flourishing life of Jews in the town of Zager. What is interesting is that in the pit where these Jews found their deaths is the grave of my late grandfather, Yehuda Yaakov Leiber, Jankelowitz's brother, whose name was Beinish, Zichrono Livracha, and Fegele Schwartz's sister, Ita Schwartz. What is interesting, two brothers married two sisters who were their first cousins. But the reason I was told that my grandfather managed to come to South Africa with his wife Ita Fega was because Ita Schwartz had a mother who was ill, and Beinish and his wife decided they cannot leave their mother behind. So they drew lots who would go to South Africa and who would stay behind. And the fate happened to be that my grandfather and grandmother were able to emigrate to South Africa, but he left behind his brother and she left behind her sister, and because they were left behind, they were executed by the Nazis. So
the Lithuanians as well.
Right, by the Lithuanian collaborators. Now, when I was there, I heard the story of this guy called Jonas Noreika. Jonas Noreika was the Lithuanian commandant who the Nazis had appointed to annihilate the Jews. And during the seminar on the Jews of Zager, I sat with a non-Jew, Ivaldas Balkunias. Ivaldas could speak English, and he told me about the story of the annihilation of the Jews. He said you people get it wrong. It wasn't the Nazis who killed the Jews. It was my ancestors. It was Ivaldas Balkunius's grandparents who were part of the mob who killed the Jews. And he told me then, remember the name, this guy Nureka, Jonas Nureka, and he told me about Jonas Nureka's daughter, a woman called Sylvia Foti, who moved from Lithuania to Chicago at the time, and he showed me on the internet that she just published an article on the crimes of her grandfather. This lady, Sylvia Foti, her intention was to write about her grandfather, what a wonderful Lithuanian patriot he was. And when she started reading details of his life, she saw that he was no patriot, but that he was a disgrace to the family and that he was a mass murderer. Ivaldas Balkunius showed me a document where one of the murderers of the Jews of Kruk sent a letter to Jonas Nureka telling him Kruk and northern Lithuania are now free of Jews. What to do with their land and property? Should we give it over to the partisans, or should we hand over everything to the Society for the Protection of Nature? How ironic, right? They murdered these Jews in cold blood, and then the local commander asks Nureka what to do with their land. To give it to the Society for the Preservation of Nature? And he showed me the answer of Nureka. Nureka told him, God forbid you give the land to the partisans. They cannot be trusted. Today they're with us, tomorrow they're against us. Give the land to the Society for the Protection of Nature. This way the land will remain in the hands of Lithuanians.
And he wrote the God forbid?
Right. He gave this order. Now, you should understand, this Sylvia Foti really wrote an unbelievable article, and she's also written a book, and she explains how at the beginning her father was aligned with the Nazis, but towards the end of the war he collaborated with the Soviets. Soviets are hated in Lithuania and in Latvia. That is the biggest insult you can give someone if you call him a Soviet. They are proud Lithuanians and proud Latvians. And in the end, the Russians didn't believe Nureka. They discovered that Nureka is a double agent, and he died in captivity of the Soviets. Today, in the independent Lithuania, because Jonas Nureka died at the hands of the hated Soviets, he has become a Lithuanian patriot, a symbol of the Lithuanian independence. And there's a whole campaign going on to discredit him. In Vilna, for example, there are many institutions that are named after the patriot Jonas Nureka. There's statues of Jonas Nureka, and it's an ongoing battle between historical revisionists and Lithuanians who do not want the truth to be swept under the carpet, that everybody know who Jonas Nureka is, the individual who was responsible for the murder of almost 4,000 Jews in northern Lithuania.
And your family?
For sure. And I think there are almost 20 members of the family who have been commemorated in our family tree, that's found on Ancestry. It was put together by Paul Lebeth Lutzen, who we affectionately call Muffy. And if you look under Jankelowitz Klein on Ancestry, you can find all the family in this tree. What is amazing is my father, my late father's name was Elchonen Reuven ben Yehuda Yaakov. In the family tree you see Yehuda Yaakov ben Elchonen Reuven. The name kept on repeating itself for generations. So I am very grateful to Muffy, to Paul Beth Lutzen, for having put together this family tree. Now, to get back to Zager, what is interesting is my grandfather, Shmuel Aryeh ben Arav Shloime, is the son of Shloime ben he's the son of Shmuel Aryeh ben Arav Shloime, is the son of Shlomo ben Shmuel Aryeh. Again, the repetition of names. So his family are from Zager. They lived in Zager. They weren't born in Zager, but he's my maternal grandfather. Grew up in Zager before he moved to the big city of Shavel. And what is interesting, one sees today in Zager how every building has a plaque relating to its past. This was the house of the rabbi. Here was the mikveh. Here was the school. Here was the bakery. Here was the pottery. Here was the butchery. Every single building in this town that has some Jewish history has a plaque that relates to the history of the town, and it's something that's been done painstakingly by this association. And I think when we look at the bad, right, the terrible history that befell the Jews of Lithuania, we must remember that there are those Lithuanians who are proud of the Jewish history and feel that it is important to commemorate the Jews who used to live there, because today there are no Jews. Almost 230,000 Jews of Lithuania were executed in the war. So I look at this as being something positive from a historical perspective, that you can go today to Zager and see how a shtetl looked. The shtetl hasn't changed. The houses are there. They're not.
Are the houses occupied by families, or they?
Yeah, life goes on, right? There are Lithuanians who live in the houses where there were shops. There are shops today. Just there is a sign that this was in this building was the pottery shop, was the butcher. I even found a sign of my late maternal grandfather, Shmuel Aryeh ben Arav Shloime, of his parents who had a concession store, and it's written there that this is where Melamed had his concession store. What happened? It's interesting that my grandfather's family changed their name from Melamed to Horwitz, so as not to get drafted into the army of the Tsar. So if they changed their name to Horwitz, they couldn't find them. But the original name of the Horwitzes of South Africa, who are my relatives, was Melamed. So it was an eye-opener. As I said, Kruk was a tiny little village. Uniskis was a big town, and Zager was a Jewish shtetl. And here you have the Jewish cemetery of Zager. Again, tombstones are in place, and nothing was vandalized. There's a wall around the cemetery, but it's a much bigger cemetery than the one in Kruk. And I was talking about plaques. Yeah, you have this plaque in commemorating the building where my maternal grandfather's parents had their concession store. So this is just one example of how these plaques look all over the town. There must be tens of them in every corner of the town where a Jew had a building, where there was a Jewish school, etc. So this was very, very important. What was interesting at the seminar, it took place also on Shabbat. Previous to coming to northern Lithuania, I was in Riga, where my maternal grandmother was from, and there I met the rabbi, Kalev Kralin. And Kalev Kralin told me that kosher food will be available for Shabbat at the seminar. Just have to register in advance. So I registered, and the family, the people with whom I commuted from Uniskis to Zager, they also availed themselves of the kosher food. The rest of the food was kosher style, but the food that we ate on Shabbos in Zager, in the big mansion of the governor of the time in Zager, was where we had services and where we had a Shabbat atmosphere. Of course, on Shabbat in the afternoon, we did a tour by foot of the town. Very beautiful, picturesque, quiet in natural surroundings. So this is something that I recommend to people who are interested in their roots, to go to a town like Zager, to feel what a shtetl was about. One should remember that more than half of the population of this shtetl were Jews before the Holocaust. So that means half of the population of the shtetl, maybe a town of 6,000 people, almost 3,000 of them were annihilated in the Holocaust. So the basic way of life in Zager was a Jewish way of life, which is no more. So what is interesting is to walk in the footsteps of these plaques to get an understanding of what a major role the Jews played in Zager. And if it hadn't been for the seminar, I would not have been able to feel what a shtetl is all about. A shtetl is a little town, right? And the amazing story here is that this shtetl was a town run by the Jews.
Mike, can I just ask, when you were walking around, did you encounter any hostility, or did you, the local people that saw you walking, did you have your yarmulke on?
Everybody.
And it was fine. You never had you didn't feel any hostility towards you, or?
Nothing. I didn't feel any hostility. In actual fact, one of the members of this association that are responsible for perpetuating the Jewish memory of Zager is an English lady, Sarah Matricki, a young lady who married a Lithuanian, and she invited the whole seminar for brifleis, for a barbecue in her home. And for sure they knew that I kept kosher, so I was given a vegetarian meal, but I felt it remarkable that Sarah Matricki and a colleague of hers, a Lithuanian businessman, Valdas Baskūnas, no relative to Valdas, but Valdas and Sarah Matricki, they together with Sarah Manobla and a lady from England, Joy Hall, these people are responsible for the ongoing activities of this association to perpetuate the Jewish memory of Zager. And should they hold another seminar, I think I will go, because I've read a lot since my visit, and one visit I think is not
was
sufficient.
it very well attended?
There must have been about 100 descendants of people from Zager who came to the seminar. They did a lot of advertising on Facebook, and this is how I got to learn about the seminar, thanks to my brother Hilton Tzvi Jankelowitz, who lives in Boston, and is also, like myself, very interested in the family's roots.
Did he attend as well?
No, he couldn't attend, but he gave me the tip, and I followed up.
And where were most of the attendees from? It's all over the world that you have the descendants?
They were from the United States, from Australia, from England, from South Africa, and
from
Israel, and locals and Jews from northern Lithuania, from Shavel. Shavel is a small Jewish community. I met a Landsman in Shavel because, as I told you, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a smos. He was a trader, and he used to trade between Shavel and Riga, and that's how he met my grandmother, Rachel Rosengarten, who they called Ray.
She was from Riga.
From Riga, but until now I'm in touch with Sanya Kerbelis. Sanya Kerbelis is a wonderful man. He is the head of the Jewish community of Shavel. He doesn't talk English. He doesn't talk Hebrew. I spoke to him in my Zubrochene Yiddish, and I communicate with him in Yiddish. And I told him that I grew up in Port Elizabeth, and Kerbel was a very well-known name in the Jewish community. And he got very, very emotional, because he told me he knew he had relatives who had moved to South Africa, and that I have answered a question of his, that there are Kerbels in South Africa. And when I put up my story on Facebook, I got contacted by a lady, Sorrel Kerbel, who lives in England, if I'm not mistaken, and who thanked me for having raised the issue of Sanya Kerbelis. Now, what was amazing in Shavel? Shavel's a big city, right? It's not a small town like Uniskis, and not a shtetl like Zager, but it's a big town. And I took the bus from Janashik to Shaule, and I got in touch with Sanya, as well as to Ivaldas Balkūnas, and Ivaldas Balkūnas very kindly took me in his car on a tour of what was Jewish Shavel. Now, Shavel, a big town with a community, with a shul. What amazed me in Shavel was their commitment to Yiddishkeit. And I'd never heard of a gentleman called Frankel. There's a gentleman in the history of Shavel. He was a wealthy Jew, and Frankel had a tannery, and Frankel employed Jews to work in this tannery of his. I had never heard of him, never knew about him, but thanks to Ivaldas, I learned a lot about Shmuel Frankel. It was amazing to see. This guy had a tannery, and around the tannery he built a shul. He built a recreation center for all his Jews, and he was a businessman, and he traveled in Europe. He employed the Jews, and he died suddenly on a business trip to Germany. And in 1920 he left the Jews without a leader. Chaim was his name. Chaimi Frankel. And today the Lithuanians have a big statue of Chaim Frankel outside his tannery. The tannery is today a museum, is an art museum. But here you see an example of a big town which had a big Jewish community, but the Jews took care of themselves. Apparently 6,000 Jews were employed in Chaim Frankel's tannery. It was something, if I hadn't been there, I would never have known. So this is why I recommend, even if you don't have a lot of knowledge, but a bit about your family, to go read up about it. Today we have Google. You can learn and to go and see what is going on there. It is amazing. So what is important is, I'll show you. You see the shul that Chaim Frankel built for his workers.
Hold on a minute. You're gonna just. This is the shul in Shavel.
Right.
A minute.
You see also the recreation center that he established for the workers, and the monument in honor of Chaim Frankelis, they called him, Chaim Frankel. So
that's wonderful. 1 minute. Yeah. That is really quite amazing. That's and the Lithuanians today put it up
recently, right? You see, the Lithuanians play both sides of the coin. On the one hand, they try to cover up that the perpetrators of the massacres were Lithuanians, but on the other hand, it's very important for them to highlight their Jewish heritage.
So you also have a picture of the Frankel Villa.
Right, that is the tannery, what's called the Frankel Villa.
That's the tannery.
Right.
Amazing.
Now, what is amazing about Shavel is that because it's a big city, there are no cemeteries. The policy of the Soviets, of Brezhnev, was that after a couple of years, one digs up all the cemeteries. One doesn't keep a cemetery. One reuses the land for other purposes. The Jews of Shavel know that where their cemetery was, the Soviets built a lunatic asylum. They built a lunatic asylum and a school over the graves of the Jews in the cemetery that was overturned. And in actual fact, when I was there was a major controversy that they were going to build a sewage pipe running right through the cemetery. The Jews of Shavel, led by Sanya Kerbelis, created a major world uproar against the authorities in Shavel that you cannot have a sewage pipe system running through and under the graves of Jews. And because of their outcry, the authorities in Shavel stopped the work. So I think what is important today is that Jews are not meek and mild. Because we have a state of Israel and Jews feel empowered, they're not cowed into silence. That if they feel that they are being downtrodden, they can open their mouths and be taken seriously. And one has to understand that the political relations between Israel and Lithuania are very good, which I think is important. But if there weren't such good relations, I don't think that the Lithuanian authorities would give a hoot about what Jews think. And because Israel lodged a complaint and made a noise, and there was an ambassador who just returned, Amir Maimon, who was loved by the community, the authorities in Lithuania took heed and stopped the desecration of the old cemetery that had been dug up by the Soviets. So it was fascinating to see all these buildings in Shavel, which were once a Jewish university, a Jewish hospital, which today exists. The Jewish university is now a university. It's a plaque.
Are there all plaques in Shavel?
Yes, everything is marked, right? They don't hide that these buildings were once the property of Jews, but there aren't Jews anymore in Shavel who can make use of these facilities. So they do not object for the hospital, for example, or the university being used by the government of Lithuania for the good of the local population. So that was interesting for me to see Shavel, to see where my grandfather, the Smos, lived, and to keep in mind that Riga was not far away. So to come to my grandmother from Riga, before I went to northern Lithuania, I was in Riga. And I always heard stories from my maternal grandmother, who was very, very literate. Her parents had sent her to St. Petersburg to study medicine, but when the First World War broke out, she had to come back to Riga to look after her siblings, because her late father, who was a well-to-do lawyer, dropped dead on the street, and her mother needed help. They were a big family, six children, and my grandmother was the oldest. So she had to cut short her studies in St. Petersburg, and she came back to Riga. Now what I learned is her family were a family of assimilated Jews, as opposed to my maternal grandfather, Shmuel Areh ben Harav Shlomo Halevi, right, from Shavel, who were learned Jews. These Riga Jews were very Germanic. They spoke German. They didn't talk Latvian, and they didn't know that much of Yiddishkeit. My my late great-grandfather, Philip Rosengarten, the lawyer, was very prosperous, and he had to keep his wife, Sophie, busy. So what did he do? He let her open a store where she would sell materials, and this is how my grandfather got to know my grandmother. He used to come and sell them leather. Sophie Eliasov was her name, her maiden name, and she took an interest in buying good quality leather from Shavel, and my grandfather took an eye on Rachel Rosengarten. And when the family emigrated to Canada, my grandmother was left behind because she was over the age, and the Canadians wouldn't give her a visa. And she tried to get a visa, and they asked her when she went for the process, and she had to go alone. She wasn't included in the family visa. They asked her, what do you do for a living? And she said, I'm a nanny, I'm a maid. And the Canadian consul asked her, show me your hands. And she showed her hands, and her fingers were the fingers not of a young lady who worked in the kitchen or toiled in housework. And he told my late grandmother, no visa for you. You're not a nanny or a housekeeper. You must be a student and an intellectual. And I'm sorry, but you'll have to stay behind. So this is when, in 1924, when my grandfather came to Riga and he heard the story of Rachel Rosengarten. He told her, well, we're leaving, right? And I want to marry you, and you'll come back with me to Shavel, and we'll go to South Africa. And that is how my maternal grandparents got married and went to South Africa.
Did they have other relatives in South Africa before?
First of all, the Rosengartens all emigrated to Canada. In 1977, I went to Canada for a student convention. I was then the international secretary of Israel's National Student Union. So I said, the conference of the North American Jewish Students Network was being held in Toronto. I said this would be a good opportunity for me to go to Canada. So I went to Toronto, but traveled to Montreal, where all my family until this day live. The descendants of the Rosengartens. So there's a big family, and it was very interesting to meet them, and I have contact with them until today. But to get back to Riga is a very modern city today, a very wealthy city, as opposed to Lithuania. My impression was that Latvia is a well-off country, as opposed to Lithuania. The only problem that these countries have is they don't have big populations. Latvia has maybe almost 2,000, and Lithuania 2 million, and Lithuania 1.5 million, Estonia another 1 million, and the young people are leaving these countries because they feel there is no future for them. And their golden Medina has been England. They go to England, and when I was there, they were all very worried about Brexit, that they wouldn't be able to travel or leave anymore to go to England because of Brexit and because of the need for visas. So when I was there was a major rush to leave the Baltic states and go to England, which wasn't difficult to get into because of there not being any visa restrictions. And that explains why there was no language problem in Lithuania or Latvia. All the young people spoke English and speak English prim and proper English. And you ask them, where do you know your English from? I studied in England. I have a degree in England. And it's a good insurance policy, because here in Lithuania or Latvia, I only make €400 a month. So, in addition to going to watch soccer and learn about Jews, I also learnt a bit about the politics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In Riga, there's a beautiful Jewish museum. There's a big Jewish cultural center, and in the basement is a wonderful kosher restaurant. And what is interesting, this big building that today serves as the center of the Jewish life of Riga was given back to the Jewish community as part of the restitution agreements that were reached between world Jewry and countries where Jewish property was seized. In the time of the communists, this Jewish cultural center, museum, offices of the Jewish Agency and the Joint Distribution Committee was the headquarters of the local Communist Party. But the Latvian government transferred the ownership of this building to the Jewish community. What is also interesting in Riga is that there's a vibrant Hasidic Chabad community, and on the other hand, a community of Misnagdim, who are against the Hasidim. And until today, right, one sees, which is amazing, one sees this animosity between the Misnagdim and the Hasidim in Riga itself.
Riga has this beautiful synagogue as well.
Right.
The Choral Synagogue. I don't know if you went
Riga.
inside.
I was in Riga. This is where I met
Beautiful synagogue.
the Petruva synagogue, where Rabbi Kalev Kralin officiates. The Peitav synagogue.
Yeah.
This is the Peitav synagogue.
Now, synagogue.
The story is, how come the Peitav synagogue still exists?
Yeah, it's
the story goes that when the Nazis were demolishing a Jewish property in Riga, the Catholic Church said, you cannot burn down this synagogue, because if you burn down this synagogue, you'll burn down our church. So
it's very close to each other.
Right, next door.
Yeah,
so the Peitav synagogue was saved, because if the Nazis had pulled it down or burnt it down, the Catholic cathedral would have been destroyed too. So that was interesting. Chabad, the attitude of Chabad is going out, reaching out. For Shabbos in Riga, I went to Chabad, right? When I went to the Peitav synagogue, I saw a sign, closed on Fridays and Saturdays. So I said, okay, if they closed on Fridays and Saturdays, it means there's no shul. So if I'm looking for a good kosher meal, all over the world, if you want kosher, look for Chabad, and you'll find them. You'll pay a minimum fee, and they'll wine and dine you, which is, I think, a beautiful way of hachnasat orchim for Shabbat. So when I sat with the rabbi Kalev Kralin in Zager, and he told me about the kosher facilities, I said, yes, I ate in the restaurant, but for Shabbat I saw Peitav synagogue is closed. He laughed. He said, it's closed for tourists. If you would have made contact with me, you could have come and eaten with us. You're a misnaged. You're not a chosid. So I laughed. I said, well, that's the difference between the misnagdim and the chasidim. The Chabad does outreach. The misnagdim wait for the Jew to look for them. So
you've got a picture, amazing picture of the memorial to the non-Jews that helped in Riga to save Jews. That's where the shul was burned.
Right.
And they've got this magnificent, in the city center, the memorial of where the shul existed. And today there's a memorial for the non-Jews that helped.
Well, here I have a picture of the Holocaust Museum. It is an amazing museum on the banks of the river, which memorializes the Jews who were killed. And here is the memorial where the big shul of Riga once stood, and which was totally destroyed by the Nazis. And here are the plaques which today commemorate the spot.
So Michael, can I just mention, with that shul, the Jews were inside the shul, and then they burnt the shul with the Jews inside.
Right, they burnt the shul down with all the Jews inside, which is something.
It's in the city center of Riga.
Right, in the center of Riga. Now, I looked for the cemetery. I said, if I'm already in Riga, I may as well go say Kaddish over the grave of my great-grandfather, Philip Rosengarten, the father of my maternal grandmother, Ray. So I went back to the Jewish museum in Riga, and the lady laughed. She said, I'm sorry, there is no Jewish cemetery. As I told you, what happened in Shavel. The Russians, the Soviets, Brezhnev, they dug up the synagogue. So you're not going to find any graves. And what she explained to me, this isn't anti-Semitism. It was the policy of the communists, of the Soviets, to dig up cemeteries. That you don't keep a cemetery the way our tradition has evolved, that a cemetery remains sacred forever. And what I learned, it's similar to Muslim tradition, that Muslims don't keep a cemetery. They also dig up a cemetery, but they put new graves where the old cemetery was. And so this was, again, travel broadens one's horizons. I think I learned a lot of anecdotes from this trip to the Baltic states. My late grandmother always used to tell me how Riga was a beautiful city. And here you see, until today, the old wooden houses of the rich in Riga.
There's even a place, the Biker Chulim hospital, and it says Biker Chulim.
Yeah. On the other hand, you see the Germanic architecture in downtown of Riga. This was the main street, and this architecture of the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, is very predominant in Riga. My grandmother, as I told you, was left behind, and she had to find lodgings because her mother sold all the property, and they took everything with them. And I saw in letters that she wrote to her sister Ella, She had a sister who she adored, Ella Rosengarten, and she wrote to Ella, who afterwards married Ella Rosengarten, her very adored sister. And I saw that all the mail coming to Ella, or to my grandmother Ray, whose family called her Lulik, everything had an address, 71 Lachplesa Boulevard. And I said, I'm going to find the 71 Lachplesa Boulevard in Riga. And I found it, right? It's an apartment building until this day, right? And I took a picture of me standing in front of the building where my maternal grandmother stayed until she left with my grandfather for South Africa.
Can I ask, was she the only one left behind?
Only one left behind, because she couldn't, because the Canadians would not put her on the family visa because she was too old.
How old was she when the family left?
And she must have been 22.
It must have been an exceptionally difficult decision for the family to leave, knowing that
they knew they would leave, and they knew that she was an independent, that she was a student. She knew the world. She'd been to St. Petersburg. She spoke Russian, and so they realized that she would be able to take care of herself. But what is interesting is that she was very close to her family. And even though she moved to South Africa, I remember as a child that she was very much in touch with her Canadian family. They moved from Lithuania, Latvia to South Africa, and they went to a village in the Free State called Forrestsmith. Forrestsmith is famous because there's a train that shares the main street with the town. So the train goes through the town in Main Street. So cars have to make way for the train. And the reason my grandfather Shmuel Aryeh went to Forrestsmith is because he had brothers who had moved there and became farmers. They were farmers, they were sheep farmers. I remember as a child we went to the sheep farm. I had a great uncle, Myram Horowitz. We went to his farm, Bergplaats, still remember it. I must have been 5 years old, and I still remember having gone to the kraal to see all the sheep. And I looked back and said, this worldly lady, Rachel Rosengarten, having studied medicine in St. Petersburg, having grown up in Riga, she landed up in Forrestsmith, right? In a dorp in South Africa because of her commitment to her husband, who didn't farm in the end, but had a concession store. My mother, Salome, and her little sister, Phyllis Biren, both were educated in Forrestsmith, both spoke fluent Afrikaans, that when my mother got married and she spoke in Afrikaans, she was asked by non-Jews in South Africa, "Is jy 'n egte Jood? Are you a real Jew?" And she said, "Yeah, for sure." She said, "Yeah, man, but you talk Afrikaans like one of us." So this was interesting. My grandmother had this connection to her family in America, that in 1936 she took a boat. She took a boat with her two daughters, with Salome and Phyllis, and they went for 1 year to America. And it's amazing to see the pictures of this 1 month sailing from Cape Town to New York. And my mother had an album of all her pictures, and to think that this was 3 years before the outbreak of the Second World War. that they went for a year to see the family in America and in
Canada.
And in Canada. Means my mother was 11 years old, and her sister must have been 5. And they went on this long journey, and they came back.
And your grandfather went as well?
No, my grandfather stayed home, right? He stayed back in Port Elizabeth. They moved from, well, he was in Forest Smith, but afterwards they moved to Port Elizabeth for a bigger town. What was amazing was this connection that my late grandmother had with her family in Canada. When I was growing up, she used to go once every 2 years or so by boat to visit the family in Montreal, but she always made sure that she'd get there when winter began, and she'd leave after winter. Why? Because the boat would go along the St. Lawrence River, St. Lawrence Riverway, and in winter this riverway is iced up. So she'd come before winter set in, and she'd leave after winter set in. And she was content that my grandfather had a concession store in Port Elizabeth, but she was a lady of the world, so she decided that she would set up a fur shop, the PE Fur Shop. And it was very popular then for wealthy people to buy furs. And she used to laugh at my grandfather and say, "You work hard for a whole year in your concession store, and I sell 3 minks a year, and 1 mink covers everything you make in a year. The second mink covers my rent and expenses, and the third mink is for expenses of the family. So I thank you," she used to tell him, "I thank you for letting me go once in a while to see the family in Canada." She used to go on grain ships, the Thors. There was a company, a Danish company called the Thor, and she went on all these different Thor ships, and these were cargo ships, and she used to buy a cabin on these ships to travel, to go to Canada. So it was a big deal to go say goodbye to Granny Ray. My son Roy is named after my grandmother. She passed away just before my bar mitzvah in 1965. It was a big shock for me. She was born in 1900, so she died young. She died when she was 65, but she was a very active and colorful individual, and she used to tell me stories as a kid of Peter the Great and everything that now you learn about. She used to tell me firsthand. So these were my bedtime stories. So when air travel came into being, she stopped going to Canada by boat, and she started going by plane. And plane was a Skymaster with propellers, and the trip took maybe 3 days.
There's many different stops.
Right, but it was always fun to hear stories from my grandmother of visiting mink farms and chinchilla farms, and seeing pictures of the family in Canada. To show you the difference of the Jews of Lithuania at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, and the Jews of Latvia, who were well off predominantly, is the story of a summer town just outside of Riga called Jūrmala. You should know in Latvian and in Lithuanian a J is pronounced Y. So we are Jankelowitz, but when in Hebrew we are called Jankelowitz, because the J in Lithuanian is pronounced like a Y. So on the internet I found a guy called Leonard Jankelowitz, and I started corresponding with him. He's not a relative, but his family also come from northern Lithuania, but on the side of Latvia. And Leonard Jankelowitz makes armored plated cars called Darts Motors. And Sacha Baron Cohen, if you see his movie, you will see one of the cars, the armored plated cars, that is made by Leonard Jankelowitz. So Leonard Jankelowitz has a dacha in Jurmala. And I remember how my grandmother used to tell me that the Rosengartens, had a dacha in Jurmala. So when I was in Riga, I made contact with Leonard, and he told me, look, it's the summer, I don't come into Riga, but you're more than welcome to come and visit me in Jurmala. I told him my story. He said, come, I'll take you around. So it's a beautiful town, Jurmala, on the sea. Something I think like the American Hamptons, people who have a home on the sea. And here I'm photographed with him at the beach.
And how far is it from Riga?
10 minutes by train.
Wow.
10 minutes by train. It was fascinating. And he told me his story, right? That he knew he was Jewish, but he didn't have any Jewish feelings. His father was a communist, right? His father didn't act like a Jew, but knew that his heritage was Jewish. He said when he was drafted into the Red Army, Leonard Jankelowitz, that's when he became a Jew. That the non-Jews called him a Jew. And once they told him, once we have a surprise for you. We have someone with a similar background as yours who's coming to our regiment. He said, it must be somebody from Riga, because this was the Soviet army, right? Mm-hmm. The guy came, he's a Jew. So he said this sparked in his consciousness that you cannot run away from being a Jew. And since that time, he's taken an interest in what it means to be a Jew. And he told me the story that his father was buried in the cemetery that has been overturned by the Soviets. So, as I said, I learned a lot on this tour, and I'll end off with which for many people is a highlight, but for me wasn't the big highlight. Was my trip to Vilna. I left the area from Vilna, but I said, everyone talks about Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lita. Maybe next time I'll spend more time in Vilna. But as a misnaged, what impressed me was to see the house in which the Vilna Gaon lived. And outside of his house, there's a statue in honor of the Vilna Gaon.
In the statue, they don't have a yarmulke on him. It's an interesting statue.
Right. But it was very interesting to see the statue of the Vilna Gaon. Again, I told you Lithuanians are doing a major attempt to show the heritage of the Jews. And here, this is the ghetto, Vilna ghetto, where they've scraped away paint that they can actually show pictures that were part of the ghetto at the time.
And the synagogue itself.
I learned that whenever you go to a shul, which is a museum, and it's closed, you go back during Mincha or Ma'ariv time, because then it's open. So the same happened to me in Vilna. I wanted to see the Coral Shul. Bibi Netanyahu had just been there a few months before, and I came and I saw it's closed, right? But then I saw it's written Mincha will be at 6. So I went at 6 to the Vilna Coral Shul.
It's beautiful, yeah.
very beautiful shul. And I met the Rabbi Krinsky, right, originally from Boston, and I had the audacity to tell him that I'm a real Litvak, right, because I'd heard there'd been a lot of faribel between Caliph Kralin, the Misnaged, and Chabad over the appointment of Krinsky as the chief rabbi of Lithuania instead of the Misnaged. So this is again part of the quarrel between Chabad and the Misnagdim. And he was very gracious, and it was very interesting to see the shul. And this is the plaque in the center of the old ghetto, which marks the expulsion of the Jews of Vilna and their annihilation in Ponar, the killing field of the Jews of Lithuania. So all in all, I think that in this hour and a half, I've covered a lot of the history. Just I'll end off. We all talk about Ponivej. So this is the bus station of Ponivej, and the building behind is the famous Ponivej Yeshiva. And this is where we had a rest stop on the bus from Shavel to Vilna. There was a rest stop in Ponivej, and they told us that this was the big Ponivej Yeshiva. So that's just an aside, but I've learned now that a big museum is being built in the town of Shadova. Shadova was also on the route between Shavel and Vilna, just before Ponivej. So maybe I'll be fortunate enough to attend the inauguration of this new museum on the history of the Jews of Lithuania. I think it's going to be dedicated in maybe 3 years after we've all passed, God willing, the coronavirus. Yeah. And I think this will be sufficient for this podcast, and I thank you, Dr. Les Glassman, for taking off your time and hearing my story.
So I'm just going to come in with you for a second. Okay. So, Michael, I just want to thank you so much. Your story and your tour in the footsteps of your ancestors and our ancestors. It's been remarkable to hear your passion and your love for Jewish history, for your roots, and you just are an amazing person. And I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to hear firsthand. And your grandparents must be very proud. You've come to Israel, you've set up a family here, a home here. And it's just been such a great honor and a privilege to be with you today. And I thank you very much. And I hope that you'll go back and you'll inspire many people who are watching this to look in their roots and to also to go back to the Haim, to Lithuania, where we came from. Very special and unique community. And you really, by going back there, you discovered so many things. And I really thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Les. It reminds me, I didn't talk about the cuisine. When I made Aliyah, I looked for kichel and herring and teglach, and I couldn't find it in Israel. One of the only places today in the world where one can get what one grandparents made, pierogen, kichel and herring, teglach, is South Africa. Because, unfortunately, the majority of Lithuanian Jews were executed, were annihilated, and the only place where today there is a cohesive Lithuanian Jewish community with tradition is in South Africa. So this amazes me when I go to South Africa, that I can eat what my late grandmother, Granny Fagler, used to make. She was such a cook. She made beautiful food, which one unfortunately cannot find anywhere except in South Africa.
You know, Michael, it's so true. When you go to a kiddush or a brocha, what we call it, there's always kickel and herring. It's the standard food. At any simcha, you'll always have kickel and herring. Parogan you'll have when you go out for dinner to people. Teglach over Pesach. This is what we were brought up on.
Right, you don't find it here. So I this was something as an aside that suddenly I said I should relate to.
Well, thank you so much, and just to be well and healthy, and to transmit this to your family and to all the people that are watching. And I really, really appreciate it.
And to all people who are able to travel, to go see the roots, see where we came from, to understand that our ancestors were simple people. They were just given the opportunity to get an education.
Mark, if I can just mention in closing something very interesting. When the war broke out and the Jews were fleeing from Poland, they were very, very warmly accepted in Lithuania. And the Jews of Lithuania were not wealthy, but they accepted fellow Jews with an open heart. And wherever you go in the world and you meet a fellow Litvak, you have a connection. There's a special connection between wherever you are. If you ex-South Africans or Americans, but if they had the origins in Lithuania, there's a special bond, an unspeakable bond. And we see it, and we see it in your travels, and I really want to thank you for sharing your incredible experience in the footstep of ancestors. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.